Hi, my name's Danny and these are my die-cast disasters. In this video I will be restoring a Matchbox Super Kings K-12 Hercules mobile crane. These were produced by Lesney, England from 1975 until 1978. They also produced a blue version and in 1978 produced the K-113 military crane truck. Let's have a closer look at our Hercules crane. It is missing a lot of paint. The windscreen is quite scratched and hazy and unfortunately cracked in the front. The wheels are in pretty good shape, they are mainly dirty. The base is in great shape apart from some paint chips. The hydraulic outriggers still work well. The crane arm works fine. But the actual hook is not in as great shape. It is quite beat up and scratched and also has a crack in it. I start by drilling out the rivets and taking the crane apart. I begin with the rivets holding the base on. This pops off easily, revealing the axles and suspension system. The hydraulic outriggers come out easily. The cab interior and motor and front windscreen are also easily removed. Next I drill out the large rivet, holding the crane onto the truck. The crane is held onto the truck with a small pin, which pulls out with a little effort. Now 2 small rivets holding on the base to the crane. Here we can see the pin more clearly. Now to remove a small axle holding on the crane arm hydraulics. I use a cutting disc on my rotary tool to cut it in half. There is a small axle towards the end of the crane arm which helps to hold the telescopic arm in place. I use the same method to remove this. The telescopic arm now just pulls straight out. I remove the crane arm hydraulics. I will leave the crane arm attached to the cab section as I think it will be easier than trying to replace a small axle. The windscreen section for the crane cab just pulls out. I now drill out the rivets holding on the suspension and wheels. I now use some paint stripper to strip the paint from the die cast parts. It is just painted on with a brush and left for a few minutes. The blistered, weakened paint is then scrubbed off with a toothbrush in some water. I use some steel wool to remove the oxidation from the base. I use a wire brush on my rotary tool to remove the oxidation from the cab and crane sections. Here are the die cast parts after paint stripping and burnishing, ready for painting. Before I spray with paint, I mask off the axle holding on the crane arm. The yellow parts are then painted with Tamiya fine white surface primer, and the base is painted with the grey primer. Here are the die cast parts after priming. Now is a good time to have a quick look at the details on them. The cab has that classic Super Kings futuristic design. It has some fuel tanks and hydraulics or something on the side of it. Here are the base sections for the truck and the crane. I think the crane section is the best part of the casting. It has some nice details. A wire spool at the back here. It has some grills and riveted panels, and the crane arm is nicely detailed. The yellow parts are then painted with Tamiya TS16 yellow. For the base of the truck, I used Tamiya TS17 gloss aluminium. The base of the crane was airbrushed with Tamiya X7 red acrylic. These are then given 2 coats of Tamiya TS13 clear. Here they are after painting. The axles have quite a few old threads wound around them, so I removed these with the help of my craft knife. The wheels have quite a lot of old dry mud or clay on them. I use my dry toothbrush to scrub this off. I use my chrome pen to rechrome the rims. Once these are well dried, I dip them in self-shining floor polish. I remove the two pins from the crane arm hydraulics. You can see here the plastic hydraulic casing has a crack in it. I carefully apply some super glue inside the crack and then hold it firmly together for a few seconds until it sets. I give the repaired area a quick sand. And then a polish. The remaining plastic parts are given a thorough scrub in some warm soapy water. Aside from the large cracks in the front, the windscreen is also fairly scratched and worn. Unfortunately, I can't really fix the cracks. I considered cutting the front section out of the windscreen and replacing it, but I think the plastic is too brittle and it will end up destroying it. I use some emery paper to sand out the scratches and scuffs from the windscreen. I then give it a polish with some polishing compound and a buffing pad on my rotary tool. That's looking a lot smoother. I do the same with the windscreen for the crane cab. The interior and motor section chrome is really in pretty good nick, so I only re-chrome the front headlights. The crane hook is in pretty rough condition. I start by gluing the crack together with a small amount of super glue. Then I add some Tamiya putty. I spread this out and try to fill in any of the dents and rough areas so I can sand them down later. The end of the hook is very worn and scratched. I spread a thin layer of putty over this to fill in the scratches and pits. This is left for 24 hours to cure. Now I can sand and file it down smooth. I give it a coat of white primer. It is then painted with Tamiya X7 red. To repair the small cut axles on the crane arm, I will use this aluminium tubing. Unfortunately, the slightly larger axle holding on the crane arm hydraulics was a tiny bit too large for the tube. So I put the pieces in my drill chuck and used a piece of sandpaper to grind them down a little bit. I cut off a small section of the pipe. I slide the telescopic arm back into the crane. I carefully push the hydraulics back into place, trying to be careful not to scratch the paint. I apply a tiny amount of superglue inside the pipe, and then holding it in place with my pliers, I push the first piece of axle through the hydraulic pin and crane arm into the small piece of pipe. Now I add a tiny drop of superglue to the second axle piece. This is also pushed into place. I use the same method to repair the other axle, but it is a bit smaller so I don't have to sand it down. I remove the masking from the crane arm axle. To put the wheels back on, the axles click into these tabs on the suspension system. I use some industrial strength adhesive to attach the suspensions back to the base. The old axle holding on the hook was too short to repair, so I'll use a small button head nail to make a replacement axle. I use a cutting disc on my rotary tool to cut the button head in half. I cut the axle to length. Now I have a small axle and an end cap. I use a tiny drop of glue to attach the end cap to the axle and hold on the hook. The pin holding the crane section to the truck is really too short to repair, so I use a small nut and bolt to replace it. I cut the bolt to length using my rotary tool. You can really see this cutting disc wearing away as it cuts through the bolt. I push the crane windscreen back into place. The base of the crane is held on with a small tab at the front and the two rivets at the back. I put my small bolt in place on the base and then attach it to the crane section using some superglue on the rivets. I had to hold this with the base downwards so that the bolt didn't fall out, so I did it off camera. I put the crane back into position on the truck. I then put on the nut and held it in place with a small drop of superglue so that it didn't unscrew when the crane was being moved around. The windscreen and interior sections are put back into place. Followed by the hydraulic outriggers. I apply a drop of glue to the rivet posts. Oops, that's a bit much. Oh well, no worries. The base is put back on, holding the outriggers and the interior in place. Finally, I'll make a couple of faux rivets to replace the ones I drilled out. I need some epoxy putty, then make a couple of very small balls and simply press them in place with this watch tool. After these have cured, I give them a quick coat of yellow paint. So before we take a look at our finished crane, let's be reminded of what we started with. With its scruffy chipped paint job, faded windows and ruined crane hook, it looked like it might be a Herculean task to get this die-cast disaster back in order. And here is our restored Hercules mobile crane. it is looking much tidier with a nice fresh shiny paint job and cleaned parts. Apart from the cracks, the windscreens are now looking clear and unscratched. The hook is smooth and straight again with a clean red paint job. Here is a closer look at the finished product. I think my Hercules crane truck came out looking much nicer than when I started. It will look very good on my shelf now alongside my military crane truck. Thanks heaps for watching everyone, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe.